The first thing the detective put in front of me was a color printout from our parking garage camera. My truck was in the frame. The timestamp said 8:03 a.m. He laid down a second page after that. Same morning, 8:11. My employee badge had opened the 7th floor door. Then he turned his laptop toward me and showed me a screenshot from our payment system. My username had approved an emergency vendor release for $186,400 at 8:27. He tapped the table once and said, "You understand why you're here, right?" The problem was, I wasn't at the office that morning. I had been 40 miles away at our East Ridge branch, standing in a warehouse office that smelled like dust and old coffee, fixing a vendor invoice and listening to a man from Nashville complain about freight charges. There were cameras there, a sign-in sheet, people who had seen me before 9. I kept saying that in the interview room, and the more I said it, the worse I felt, because I also understood exactly why I looked guilty. The login was mine, the badge was mine, the truck was mine, and over the previous 6 months, there had already been just enough small problems tied to my name to make me look like a man getting sloppy. At that point, I still wasn't saying the worst part out loud. My wife had been helping build the case against me for months. I'd worked for the same company for 12 years. We were a regional industrial supply company, not glamorous. We sold parts, fittings, replacement assemblies, rush orders, and boring things nobody thinks about until something breaks. My department handled vendor contracts, settlements, and change orders, which meant I spent most of my time cleaning up paperwork other people didn't want. I was never one of the ambitious ones. I didn't chase management, didn't network, didn't try to turn every meeting into an audition. I just knew where old files were, which customers always needed extra documentation, and which contracts had ugly exceptions buried in them. For a long time, that was enough. Managers liked me because I made things easier. HR liked me because I didn't cause noise. I met my wife Lauren there. She came in on a systems cleanup project, one of those internal initiatives where corporate decides old processes need to be modernized, and everybody who actually does the work gets dragged into meetings about efficiency. Most people on those teams are either smug or useless. Lauren wasn't. She was sharp, quick, and very good at asking questions in a way that made people think she was on their side. At first, she came by my desk because I knew the history behind a lot of our vendor files. Later, it turned into lunch, then texting, then everything else. She had a way of making me feel like I'd been underselling myself for years. She'd ask why I stayed in the same role, why I talked about keeping life simple, like it was some kind of moral virtue, why I never tried to move up. I didn't hear any of that as criticism then. I heard it as interest. We got married a little over a year after we started dating. The first couple years were easy in the way adult life is easy when nothing dramatic is happening. We both worked. We bought a townhouse. We argued about paint colors and where to put the better lamp. We hosted Thanksgiving once and swore we'd never do it again. It wasn't exciting, but it was solid. And I thought solid counted for more than most people admitted. Lauren started moving up before I did. Then again after that. At first, I was proud of her in the simple way husbands are supposed to be. She worked hard, read people well, and volunteered for things other people dodged. She started getting noticed by senior management, especially by Daniel Mercer, who came in as director of operations and moved up fast because he looked and sounded like the kind of man executives trust too quickly. Daniel was polished without being warm. He liked words like ownership, agility, and visibility. He could make an ordinary status meeting feel like you were defending your entire career. Younger employees wanted his approval. People who'd been around longer mostly learned to keep their answers short. Lauren began working closer to him after her second promotion. That was when things at home started changing. Not in one dramatic blow, more like small edits. She stayed later more often. She started taking calls in the hallway instead of the couch. She'd come home, look at her phone, and go distant for the rest of the night. A lot of those calls had the same explanation. Work. I believed that longer than I should have, mostly because it was plausible. We both worked in the same place. There were busy seasons, audits, quarter-end issues, vendor disputes. I didn't want to be the insecure husband who turned normal job stress into a character flaw, but there were moments that stuck with me. One night she got home after 9 and stood in the kitchen without taking off her coat. I asked if everything was okay. She looked tired, but not in the usual way. More agitated than tired. Then she asked, "Do you ever think you're going to wake up one day and realize you built your whole life around staying comfortable?" I laughed a little because it was such an odd question for that moment. I said, "Comfortable sounds pretty good to me lately." She didn't smile. "That's what I mean." She went upstairs after that. I stood in the kitchen with the burner still on and felt like I'd missed the real conversation by about 10 miles. Around the same time, little problems started showing up at work. A vendor packet I'd finalized was missing a supporting page by the time it got to legal. A change order file I knew I had left pending showed up as approved. An update note appeared under my login after hours on a night I had been at my mother's house. A client meeting invite went out from my account with the wrong attachment. Each one came with the same kind of mild but increasingly irritating conversation. "Anything going on we should know about? Are you stretched thin? Just tighten the process on your end." None of those were huge on their own. That was the problem. They were small enough to look believable. I went to IT after the fourth one. I told a guy named Brian that a couple system timestamps didn't line up with where I had actually been. He pulled up my activity and said it was all coming from my workstation or my normal credentials. Then he gave me the polite half-smile people use when they want you gone without saying that. "Could be cached sessions," he said. "Could be somebody used your desk if you forgot to lock it. I lock it. Then change your password and lock it harder." That was the level of help I got. I changed the password. I started locking my screen if I stood up for 30 seconds. I stopped leaving my badge on my desk. For a couple weeks, things settled down. Then I got called into my manager's office because a dormant vendor profile had been reactivated, and the initial review line showed my name. I remember standing there, looking at the monitor over his shoulder, and feeling embarrassed in a way that had nothing to do with guilt. "I didn't touch that file." He leaned back and said, "Mark, I'm not saying you did it on purpose. I'm saying it's on your trail." That phrase kept coming up. Your trail. As if anything attached to my login was naturally mine. I talked to Lauren about it one night in bed. She was answering emails while I was trying to explain why the pattern didn't feel random anymore. She said, "Is it possible you just have too much on your plate?" "That sounds like my manager." "Well, maybe your manager has eyes." I turned toward her. "You think I'm imagining it?" She finally put her phone down and looked at me. "I think it's a pretty serious claim to say someone's using your credentials without proof." "I know. So get proof." Then she picked the phone back up, and that was the end of it. That was the first time I had the feeling that she wasn't hearing me as her husband. She was hearing me as an inconvenience. Things got worse after Lauren moved into a process controls role that gave her access across departments. Officially, she was helping standardize procedures. Unofficially, it meant she suddenly knew everybody's business and had a reason to be almost anywhere in the building. She also started sounding more like Daniel, more impatient, more contemptuous of anything she considered stagnant. She never said outright that I had become an embarrassment to her, but there were nights when I could hear it underneath whatever words she did use. At the company holiday party that year, Daniel spent half the night steering her around the room with a hand on her elbow. Nothing obvious, nothing I could point to without sounding jealous. Just the kind of familiarity people use when they already think they belong in the same story. At one point, he introduced her to 2 vice presidents from corporate and clapped me on the shoulder like an afterthought. "Lauren says you're the institutional memory around here." I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. Later in the car, I said, "You and Daniel looked pretty busy tonight." She stared out the window and said, "That's what leadership looks like at those events." You can't really fight a sentence like that without sounding small, so I didn't. Around then, she also started borrowing my truck more often. Her SUV had steering issues and spent a lot of time at the shop. When she had to leave early or stay late, she'd ask for my truck because it had better parking access and was more reliable. I never thought twice about that. Married people share cars, chargers, passwords, and routines. Lauren knew where I dropped my badge when I changed clothes. She knew the code I used for too many things. She knew I left spare keys in the bowl by the garage door because I'd done it for years. None of that felt risky at the time. It just felt married. The first formal write-up landed in March after a settlement packet went to legal without 2 supporting emails attached. The delay cost the company money. Not a fortune, but enough to get attention. My manager called me in. Daniel sat there for visibility, and HR added a process compliance note to my file. I tried to explain that I had attached those emails. Daniel listened with that controlled executive face he always wore when he wanted to look calm in front of witnesses. Then he said, "Intent isn't really the issue. Control is." That sentence stayed with me. At that company, it didn't matter whether something actually came from you. It mattered whether it could be hung on you neatly. After that meeting, Lauren and I drove home mostly in silence. At a red light, she said, "You need to stop reacting like every correction is a personal attack." It is a personal attack. "No," she said. "It's what happens when people stop trusting your process." She didn't say they. She said people. A week later, I asked Denise, one of the few co-workers I trusted, whether she'd heard anything beyond normal office gossip. She closed the opening in my cubicle wall before she answered, which told me enough. She said, "Daniel's been asking weirdly specific questions." About what? Whether you ever work remote on settlement files, whether you leave your desk open, whether you cover other branches if someone calls out. I stared at her. She shrugged a little. "I figured it was staffing stuff." It should have hit me harder right then. It didn't. I was still trying to hold 2 versions of my life together at once. The one where things were off, and the one where they were still basically normal if I just stayed calm enough. There were personal signs too, and I hated every one of them. Lauren's phone started living face down. She got quicker about clearing text threads. She snapped at small questions. Once I came downstairs early on a Sunday and found her speaking quietly into her phone in the kitchen. She turned when she heard me and said, "I thought you were asleep." "Who's that?" "Daniel." I just stood there. She added, "He's at the airport. There's a pricing issue on one of the state accounts." I made coffee and went out to the garage to move tools around because it was easier than deciding whether I was officially the kind of husband who needed to ask the next question. What I remember most now is not one giant red flag. It's how many little humiliations a person can absorb while still protecting the life he thinks he has. By early summer, I was carrying dread into work every morning. I started keeping a notebook in my desk drawer. Dates, times, file names, who had touched what, when I changed a password, when I was away from my desk. I felt stupid doing it, paranoid. But I also knew something wasn't right. The week before everything blew up, Lauren and I had an argument at the kitchen table that still plays in my head. I had a legal pad beside me because I was trying to figure out why a client amendment showed as reviewed under my credentials while I'd been in a training session across the building. She came in, saw the papers, and said, "You're still doing this?" "Yeah, because it keeps happening." She set her bag down a little too hard. "Maybe because you keep feeding it." "Feeding what?" "This idea that somebody's after you. That every mistake has to be a conspiracy. It's not every mistake." She folded her arms. "You know what I think? I think you hate that other people moved faster than you did, and now every correction feels personal." I looked at her for a long second because that didn't sound like irritation. It sounded like something she'd heard before. Then I said, "Is that what Daniel says?" Her expression changed. Just a little. "That's not fair." "Is it true?" She took her coat off and hung it over the chair. "I'm not doing this tonight. You already are." But she went upstairs anyway. The next morning she acted normal. Too normal. She asked if I wanted coffee, kissed my cheek on the way out, and left for work like nothing had happened. The day of the fraud was a Tuesday in July. Lauren left first, earlier than usual. She said her SUV was still in the shop and asked if she could take my truck because she might need to go from the office to one of the plants with Daniel later that afternoon. I said sure and grabbed her keys. At 6:18 that morning, while I was still getting dressed, Steve Carr from our East Ridge branch called. His kid had been sick all night and he needed coverage for a vendor reconciliation. That wasn't unusual. East Ridge was smaller, and I'd covered there before because I knew their older vendor files. Steve sounded tired and embarrassed. I said I could do it. I drove Lauren's SUV to East Ridge, signed in a little before 8, and spent the morning exactly where I later said I was. There were cameras. There were 3 employees who saw me. There was a vendor rep who argued with me over a freight adjustment at 8:30 and would later remember every second of it because investigators called him twice. At around 9:40, I noticed a few missed calls, one from the main office and others from an unknown number. I called back and got passed around until a voice I didn't recognize asked whether I was still at East Ridge. I said yes. The voice said, "Do not leave. We need to speak with you." That was the moment the day changed shape. 2 detectives from County Financial Crimes met me there just after noon. They used the branch conference room. My manager told me to cooperate in a tone that already sounded like distance. They asked if I had approved an emergency release tied to a vendor called Archer Industrial Recovery. They asked whether I knew the vendor's bank account had been changed that morning. They asked whether I understood that the money had gone to a shell company registered 3 months earlier. I said no to all of it. Then they showed me the trail. My truck entering the main office garage at 8:03. Badge access to the 7th floor at 8:11. Network login from my workstation at 8:14. Vendor profile edit at 8:19. Approval at 8:27. There was even a grainy hallway image of someone in office clothes moving toward my section. You couldn't see a face clearly. It didn't matter. The build was close enough. I said, "I wasn't there." The older detective asked, "Then who had your truck?" I hesitated. It sounds stupid now, but saying "my wife" in that room felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Also because I still didn't know. I knew Lauren had my truck. I knew she was supposed to be at headquarters. I knew enough to be afraid of the answer. I didn't know enough yet to say it like a fact. So I said, "My wife borrowed it this morning." The younger detective wrote that down right away. They kept asking questions. Did anyone else know my passwords? Probably my wife knew some variation of them. Did anyone have access to my badge? At home, yes. Did I ever share my login? No. Had there been prior irregularities tied to my account? Yes, and I'd complained about some of them. Did I have proof? Not much, just notes and emails. That part was humiliating, because I sounded exactly like what I looked like. A man with his name all over a fraud trail trying to explain why it wasn't him. When they confirmed I had been at East Ridge before 8, the tone changed, but not all the way. I wasn't under arrest. I also wasn't exactly free. They imaged my phone, told me not to access company systems, and said I needed to stay available. I got back to the parking lot around 6 that evening and sat in Lauren's SUV for a while before turning it on. All I wanted was to get home and force the day into one clear shape. Either there was some explanation I couldn't see yet, or my life was about to come apart in my own kitchen. The house answered that before I made it upstairs. It wasn't ransacked. It just had that wrong quiet a house gets when someone leaves fast, but knows what matters. The bowl by the garage door was empty. The hall closet stood half open. Lauren's travel backpack was gone. One of the guest room drawers was pulled out too far. I called her name anyway. Then I called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. Upstairs, the top dresser drawer was open, and the passport wallet was gone. Mine was still there. Hers wasn't. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at that for a while. Then my phone rang from an unknown number. It was the older detective. He asked, "Is your wife with you?" "No." "Have you spoken to her?" "No." "She did not report back to work after 10. We haven't located her." That didn't land as new information. It landed as confirmation. After the call, I went downstairs and opened the household iPad because I wanted to check our joint account. Lauren still had her personal email linked on it because she used it for travel confirmations. There was already a notification on the lock screen when it woke up. An airline booking confirmation. I opened it before I thought about whether I should. 2 one-way tickets bought that afternoon. Charlotte to Denver, Denver to Reno. 2 names, Lauren Hale and Daniel Mercer. For a second I just stared at the screen because I understood it too fast. The late calls, the distance, the way she had shut down when I said somebody might be using my login. The questions Denise said Daniel had been asking about my routine, the write-ups, my truck in the garage, my badge on the 7th floor, my username on the release. It all stopped being scattered and became one thing. I forwarded the email to myself and then to the detective. That night I sat in the living room with all the lights on and replayed the last year of my marriage like I was going back through security footage after a break-in. Around midnight, Denise texted me. She said company counsel and security were pulling old access logs and Daniel hadn't been reachable for hours. Then I asked her something that had started bothering me the second I saw the airline email. Was Steve's call that morning really last minute? She replied a few minutes later. Steve's kid was sick. But Daniel texted him at 5:40 asking if he could get someone from contracts to cover East Ridge because Mark knows the Archer files better than anyone. Archer was the same vendor tied to the fraudulent payment. That was when it stopped feeling like an affair and started feeling like a trap. The next few days moved in a way that felt both frantic and weirdly administrative. Detectives photographed my house. They took my work laptop and my home desktop. My company put me on immediate, unpaid leave pending investigation. My sister's husband got me the name of a defense attorney before the next morning was over. The neighbors watched evidence bags go out of my front door like they were trying not to look while obviously looking. I learned more from my attorney than from anyone at work. The money had gone to a shell LLC tied to a burner email. That same burner email had been used to set up a storage account containing vendor forms from files I had handled. Some had been altered. Others had supporting documents removed and later restored to create a pattern of errors under my name. The building logs showed my badge ID had been used after hours several times in the previous months in areas where I had no recorded business. Security believed the badge had been cloned, which was possible with our old proximity cards if someone had repeated access to them. When my attorney told me that, I actually laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because there was something disgusting about how ordinary it was. People imagine setups like this involve hackers and movie-level tricks. Mine involved a badge I left by the mudroom and a wife who knew when I showered. The password side was even worse. I had used some variation of the same password for years. Lauren had seen me type it from the kitchen table plenty of times during audit season when I worked from home. Looking back, there were probably a dozen easy moments where she could have confirmed what she already knew. What finally moved investigators off me was the East Ridge timeline, branch security footage, my phone location history, and the truck. Lauren had badged into the garage with my access tag in the vehicle, used my cloned badge upstairs, and accessed my machine before most of the floor filled up. Daniel pushed the second approval layer through with his own permissions and expected it to disappear inside normal exception traffic. It might have worked too, if they hadn't gotten greedy with the amount, and if I hadn't had a clean alibi at another branch they helped create. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. Lauren and Daniel didn't make it to Reno. The detectives had the itinerary from the iPad email, and TSA pulled them aside in Denver during the connection. From what I was later told, Daniel asked for a lawyer immediately. Lauren cried, then stopped, then asked whether she could make one call. She didn't call me. The affair itself ended up being almost the least surprising part once everything else came out. Phone records showed months of contact outside work hours. Hotel charges surfaced from conferences where she'd told me she was sharing a room with another woman from operations. Messages recovered later made it clear Daniel had spent a long time working on 2 tracks at once, sleeping with my wife and building a story around me. What hurt more than the affair was how easy they found me to use. Daniel didn't need Lauren to believe I was a bad man. He just needed her to believe I was passive, unambitious, and easy to blame. Apparently, he'd been saying some version of that for months, and because it matched whatever quiet resentment she had already started feeding, she let it stick. The company went into panic mode after the arrests. People who had ignored me suddenly remembered I'd raised concerns. HR wanted to review earlier reporting channels. Security wanted to know every time my badge might have been out of my sight. A senior VP I barely knew called to say the company took employee integrity seriously, which was a rich thing to hear at that point. My unpaid leave became paid. Then it became a separation with severance after my attorney made it very clear we weren't going to pretend the company's controls had been fine. The practical part that got to me most, strangely enough, was the house. Lauren wasn't there, but she was everywhere. Her winter coat, her coffee mug, a half-used shampoo bottle, a charger plugged into the wall on her side of the bed. There are a lot of ordinary objects in a marriage that don't feel loaded until the person attached to them becomes someone you don't recognize. My sister came over one Saturday with boxes and asked if I wanted help packing Lauren's things into the guest room. I said not yet. Then I stood in the bedroom doorway for 10 full minutes because I couldn't tell whether I was refusing out of grief or stubbornness. I filed for divorce before the criminal case hit its first real hearing. There wasn't much romance left to preserve once law enforcement and company counsel were in the same sentence every day. Still, the paperwork felt ugly in a way I hadn't expected. Petition, disclosure, division of assets. Everything sounded so clean compared to what had actually happened. I didn't see Lauren in person for almost 3 months. The first time I saw her again was in a conference room at her attorney's office for document signing tied to the divorce and property agreement. She looked thinner, not dramatically, just worn down in a way that didn't seem temporary. She looked like somebody who had spent a long time explaining herself to people who no longer cared. The lawyers did most of the talking. House, retirement accounts, personal property. Stipulations tied to possible restitution, real adulthood. At one point, they stepped out to revise a page with the wrong account suffix, and Lauren and I were alone for maybe a minute. She looked down at the table and said, "I know you probably never want to hear from me again." "That's true," I said. She nodded once. Then she said, "It didn't start where it ended." I almost laughed. "You think that helps?" "No." That was one thing I'll give her. She didn't try to sell me a redemption speech. She kept looking at the papers and said, "At first it was work. Then it was him talking about you like you were already being pushed out. Like everybody knew it except you. He made it sound inevitable. So you helped. Not all at once." That answer made me angrier than if she had just said yes. "Which part was gradual?" I asked. "Sleeping with him or putting my name on things?" Her face tightened. "I know what I did." "Do you?" She didn't answer. Then she said, "The first time it was a small document access thing. He said he needed to check a control gap. After that it became another thing, then another. By the time I understood what he was really building, I was already in it too deep." I said, "That sounds practiced." She shook her head. "I'm not asking you to make me sound better." "Good." There was a long silence after that. Then I asked the question I'd been carrying for months. "Why not just leave?" She finally looked at me then. For a second I thought I might get some clean, useful answer. Instead, she said, "Because by then leaving would have meant admitting what kind of person I was." That was probably the most honest thing she said all day. The lawyers came back in. We signed. Her hand shook once while she initialed the last page. I went home and packed the last of her things into one box. Not much was left. Scarves, notebooks, a framed beach photo, and an envelope of wedding pictures neither of us had wanted badly enough to fight over in front of attorneys. I almost threw the photos out. I didn't. I put them in storage with tax records and old manuals because apparently that was the amount of sentiment I had left. The criminal case took its time. My notebook from work ended up mattering because it showed I had been documenting unexplained access issues before the main fraud. Denise gave a statement. Steve did too. Brian from IT got a lot more interested in system logs once lawyers started asking questions under oath. Daniel tried to frame part of it as sloppy controls and shared credential culture, which wasn't entirely false. That was part of how the scheme worked. But it didn't explain the cloned badge, the shell company, the travel, or the recovered messages. It definitely didn't explain why my wife had been on a plane with him. A year after that interview room, I had written confirmation that I was cleared and a confidential settlement that helped pay my legal bills, refinance the house, and get on with my life. People hear settlement and think victory. Mostly it felt administrative, just with more paper. The relief came from smaller things. A letter saying I was no longer a subject of the investigation. The first time I checked my bank app without my stomach tightening. The first job application where I didn't have to write a defensive explanation because my attorney had negotiated the separation language properly. I sold the townhouse eventually. I couldn't keep paying that mortgage alone forever, and I got tired of rooms that still felt like scenes. I moved into a rental for a while, then into a smaller house in another part of the county after I started working for a maintenance supply company that doesn't know me as the guy from the fraud case. People ask whether I should have seen it sooner. The answer is yes, but not in the satisfying way people want. There was no single moment where any sane person would have known for sure. There were 100 moments where I could have acted differently if I'd been willing to accept the ugliest explanation first. That's true at work too. I should have pushed harder with IT. I should have escalated the unexplained access issues in writing sooner. I should have stopped trying to solve everything quietly. But hindsight is a very generous employee. It clocks in after the damage and acts like it would have handled everything better. I know more about Lauren's life now than I want to, mostly because mutual acquaintances leak things without meaning to. She took a plea. Daniel did too. There are restrictions, repayment plans, years of consequences, all of which sound serious on paper and still don't feel proportionate to what they burned down. I don't fantasize about revenge anymore. For a while, I imagined saying the perfect thing if I ever saw Daniel again. But that passed. Anger gets heavy if you carry it long enough. Then it gets dull. Then it gets expensive. What stayed was smaller. For months after the arrest, any time I heard a phone vibrate in a restaurant or waiting room, my body reacted before my brain did. Just a little jolt. Just enough to remind me how many nights I'd heard Lauren say, "It's work," and accepted it because accepting it let me keep my life in one piece a little longer. I also got strange about access. I log out of everything. I check locks more than I used to. My work badge stays in a drawer now, not on a hook by the door. The first woman I dated after the divorce laughed when she saw me do that and asked if I thought somebody was going to steal my exciting office credentials. I laughed too and changed the subject. Some stories are too long for dinner. The last meaningful thing Lauren ever said to me came through her attorney during a stupid argument over an old watch that got packed with the wrong property. Buried in the email chain was one line she wanted passed along. She said she was sorry for choosing somebody who made it easy to think of me as disposable. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I closed the email and forwarded it to my lawyer without replying. Because that was the truth underneath all of it. Not the money. Not even the affair. Plenty of marriages die from ordinary cheating. What turned mine into something else was the decision, repeated over and over, to treat me as the easiest explanation in the room. The husband who would keep his head down. The employee who would take the correction. The man whose quietness could be turned into guilt if you stacked enough bad timestamps around it. Maybe that was always the risk in being the dependable one. People start thinking your steadiness belongs to them. The case is mostly over now. The paperwork never really is. There are still occasional calls with attorneys and the kind of administrative debris white-collar crime leaves behind. My life is quieter than it used to be. That sounds sad when I say it like that, but it isn't. Quiet stopped meaning safe for a while. I had to learn the difference again. Sometimes I still think about that interview room, the detective tapping the printout of my truck, the certainty in his face when he assumed the simplest story had to be the right one. I understand why he thought that. Almost everybody did at first. The evidence had my name all over it because that was the point. What I didn't understand then, and do now, is how little it takes to make a life look false from the outside. A few access logs, a familiar password, one person who knows where you leave your keys. I still work an ordinary job. I still keep too many labeled folders in my office. I still buy my mother's prescription when she forgets. The difference now is that when something feels off, I don't tell myself a calmer story just because it's easier to live inside. And I never leave my badge by the door anymore.